Hi everyone, this is Alyssa Bonner, and in this video I will be sharing my Diverse Learner project for EDC 563. So this project will reflect the learners that are in a regular education first grade classroom. This classroom has many learners, including but not limited to students who are defined as being part of diverse groups such as special education, English language learners, attention deficit disorder, Native American, auditory processing disorder, and poverty. So in this presentation today, you'll hear the lesson objectives, you'll hear about some scaffolding and modifications that were made for diverse learners in the classroom. You'll hear and see the materials required for this lesson, as well as the assessments that will be used to determine the mastery of the objectives. So like I said earlier, this will take place in a regular education first grade classroom. This classroom has 20 students, 11 of them are male and 9 are female. The general culture of the classroom is Caucasian, with 19 of the 20 students being English speakers. Well, there's one student that identifies as being Native American, and one is an English language learner. His native language is Spanish. 7 of the students in the classroom have IEPs. Of those students, 4 are for speech and language services only, and the other 3 students receive services including reading, writing, speech, and language. The content focus of this lesson will be reading, and this lesson would typically take place in late March at the very beginning of a unit that is focused on narrative text. So prior to this unit, the students were in a nonfiction unit where they were looking at nonfiction text features, they were learning about main ideas and details, and they worked on comparing facts from 2 nonfiction texts. And before that unit, the students were in a narrative unit that focused on identifying and describing story elements, comparing and contrasting narrative text, and answering and asking questions about a narrative text. This current unit is an author study on Leo Lionni. The reading goals of this unit include the ability for students to retell narrative stories, understand a story's central theme or message, compare and contrast stories, and use illustrations to describe character feelings. I selected 4 students from my classroom to discuss in further detail in this project. The first student is Rosie, and she is considered a special education student. She is a Caucasian female. Her archetypes would be described as individualism, low context communication, and large power distance. Rosie has an ADHD diagnosis as being in the works, kind of in progress. She also has a severe speech sound disorder, which makes it extremely difficult to understand her. Unless you know her very well and you don't really know the context, it's very difficult to know what she's saying. She also has language goals. Because of her severe speech sound disorder, Rosie also has delays in her literacy development, so she receives daily support from both a special educator and a reading specialist. Sienna is the one student in the classroom who identifies as being Native American. She's also female. So her archetypes would be described as collectivism, high power context, and small power distance. Sienna also is in the process of having an ADHD diagnosis. Sienna presents with low vocabulary. She often speaks in very short sentences. She writes in short sentences. Sienna also meets Sienna meets daily with a reading specialist as well as the math coach. Ethan is a student who is from a low socioeconomic status. He is actually considered to be a homeless student. He shares time with his mom and his dad, and since his mom is considered homeless, Ethan is also considered homeless. So he's actually bused from another town into the school district. Ethan is a Caucasian male. His archetypes would be considered individualism, low context communication, as well as large power distance. He receives occupational therapy services weekly, and he also receives speech and language services. Christian is an English language learner. He is a new student to the classroom. He identifies as being Hispanic. He receives daily support from his ESL teacher. He also has an assistant who joins him during writing time. I'm sorry, he meets with the ESL teacher during writing and phonics time, and he has an assistant during math and science times. He's considered a WIDA level 2 in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And Christian is another student in the classroom who has an ADHD diagnosis in the progress. So the content objective for this lesson has to do with the reading literature standards in grade 1. After reading a grade level text, the students will be able to retell the story using at least 5 key details. The WIDA standard is standard 2. English language learners communicate information, ideas, and concepts necessary for academic success in the content area of language arts. For the speaking objective, the students will use oral English to retell a narrative story that includes characters, setting, and major events with members of their group. The listening objective says that the students will use oral English to collaborate with members of a group to plan and design a poster that illustrates a retell of that narrative story. In reading, the students are going to use oral English to identify the characters, setting, and major events in order to retell the story. And the students will be using written English to retell the story, including those story elements. There are several materials that will be needed for this lesson. The first is a teacher-created anchor chart that includes the steps to story retelling. They will also be given a story retelling rope, where each part of a story retell is hole punched, and then the student can slide it on the rope or off the rope, so they can sequence the retell on the rope, or they can move it around, and that helps them have a visual as well as a kinesthetic approach to story retelling. Students will also have multiple copies of the text, and photocopies of the illustrations will be used. That way the students can move the illustrations to help support their retell of the story. There will also be listening and speaking posters hung in the classroom, but also small copies will be handed out to each of the groups. Not pictured in this presentation are some other materials, including poster board and glue, scissors, markers. There will also be speaking and writing frames for the students to use, and those will have the visual attached. So the house will go with the characters were, the people will go with the setting was, so that the students have, again, a visual to help support their speaking and their writing during the retell. So to start the lesson, the teacher would activate prior knowledge of story elements, ask the students to share what they remember about parts of a story. This teacher will also set the purpose that today the students will be using those story elements to retell the story, and she'll introduce the anchor chart. During the read aloud, this teacher will have, prior to reading the story, marked spots where she wants to stop and ask the students to turn and talk about the elements. For example, which characters have we met so far? Do we know the setting? Tell someone next to you what the problem is. The teacher will then model retelling with the retelling rope and refer to the anchor chart. The students will work in groups of 4, and there will be facilitators during that time. The teacher, the special education teacher, the ESL teacher, as well as another teacher assistant will be in the classroom. And there will be one independent group, students who have already demonstrated success with lessons similar to this one. And during their work time, the students are going to collaborate to develop a poster, including illustrations and writing, that show the sequential order of the story retell. During the speaking part, students will be supported from speaking frames. All 4 of the students have difficulty with syntax, so these sentence frames and speaking frames will allow them to start all of their sentences properly, so that they just need to complete the sentence. The students, during the listening portion, will practice making eye contact when others are speaking. And they will also be using a thumbs up or a thumbs down to signal if they agree or disagree, rather than interrupting their partners. All 4 students have demonstrated difficulty with waiting their turn. They also need prompting to add on to others' ideas, so they will, again, have those posters to prompt them. During the read aloud, the students are going to be prompted to turn and talk at various points in the story about the character, setting, problem, and events, as well as solution. These 4 students can also have a retell rope in their hands to help them with the visual and kinesthetic support. For the writing portion, the students will work with members of their group, and they're going to write a sentence for each story element that they're using in their retell, or each key detail that they're recalling. They can either copy the sentence frames, or they can simply glue the sentence frames onto their poster board. So the writing frames will be provided for all 4 of those students. For the assessment, I decided to use both a checklist and anecdotal notes as I facilitate, or as I move group to group, be checking in with the students in each group and simply checking if they were able to identify the different story elements, and then taking any anecdotal notes that I noticed, such as frustration, or frequently referring to the text for support. And to assess their speaking skills, I will be going around again with a checklist and simply marking either yes or no that they were able to speak, to identify and describe the character setting and major events in a story. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to any feedback that you have.